In this week's parsha, we have a tremendous and important declaration of faith, in a certain sense, the seminal statement of Judaism. And that is, Na'aseh v'nishma, we will do and we will hear. And this is so powerful because we committed to keeping the Torah, to observing the Torah, even before we understand it. That's the typical understanding of why this statement is so powerful, so meaningful, so moving. I realized recently that there's a deeper meaning here, which is perhaps in a sense even more powerful than that simple meaning. And that is as follows. I realized that Na'aseh v'nishma, we will do and we will hear, suggests that there are certain things that we can only hear by virtue of doing them. Which means that while the typical understanding is that, okay, look, I'm going to hear something, I'm going to understand something, but I'll commit to doing it even before I understand it. What I'm adding is that actually the greatest understandings follow action, which means practically and simply that to expand our minds into realms, into ways of thinking, into ways of being that wouldn't have occurred to us otherwise, we often need to do something, and then the fact that we're doing something extreme, doing something that seems prima facie to be inexplicable, forces us to reach an understanding of what we're doing. And that understanding, and this is the key, that understanding that we can reach, we would never have reached had we not forced ourselves through our actions. And an excellent example of that, I think, is Eretz Yisrael, is the concept of Eretz Yisrael, which is a very, very lofty concept. Those of you who are familiar with my sefer, my recent book, Haaretz Asher Erecha, know that the idea of the holiness of Eretz Yisrael is a very abstract and lofty concept, appropriate, we can say, for prophets. And yet, we commit in action to the concept of a holy land. We go and live in a holy land. We insist that it's holy without necessarily being able to explain how. And that, of course, creates a lot of tension, and it puts us in danger. And the reason why it creates tension and puts us in danger is because anytime you do something that you cannot justify, you're essentially doing something that engenders suffering, whether it's suffering within yourself because you're doing something that you can't live up to fully, or it's because you're suffering from others to whom you seem to be unreasonable, obstinate, and obtuse, because here you are doing things and insisting on things that seem to be unjustified. However, by virtue of doing that, so going back to that example, by virtue of us embracing Eretz Yisrael, I maintain that we are going to discover the theory, we are going to develop the theory that justifies our practical embrace of Eretz Yisrael. And I believe this simply by observation and thinking, that the kind of theories that will justify the Holy Land and the holiness of a land are only going to be developed because we need to develop them. So this is a psychology, this is a facet of human nature, that there are certain ways of thinking that people might be capable of, but will never reach until they back themselves into a corner, and they back themselves into the corner by virtue of doing. So we will do and we will hear means we will do things that on the face of it are extreme and unreasonable. And by doing those unreasonable things, we're going to put ourselves into a situation where we are forced to hear, first to develop an understanding that we would never have developed had we not blocked ourselves into that corner, had we not done things that seem to be extreme and necessitate extreme expansions of the human mind, extreme lofty levels of consciousness, something like a nation who's acting prophetically. So this is the big secret of we will do and we will hear. The secret is that we jump into action even before we can justify it, because we will never reach the justification unless the action forces us to justify. Now, there's a famous Gemara in Masechta Shabbos where I think it was Rava who was sitting and learning, and he was bleeding from his thumb. because he didn't notice that he was pressing on his thumb while he was learning. And a heretic accosted him and said, "You're a hasty nation. Put your mouths before your ears. You committed before you even heard. You should have seen. You should have first determined whether you can live up to the Torah before you accept it." And Rava says that the pasuk says in Mishlei that the wholesomeness of the upright will lead them in the right path. And I think what the Gemara is alluding to is that there's suffering that follows from committing to what we don't understand. There's suffering, just like Rava was suffering unwittingly because he was committed to the Torah. And Rava's answer is that, yes, there is suffering on that path, but the wholesomeness of the upright leads them, meaning to say, we are willing to take this path, even though it involves suffering, because we are confident that eventually it will work itself out due to our innocence and wholeheartedness. And if you think about it, especially if you're familiar with my recent book, you know that there's something that actually is the corollary to this, something that stands in contradiction to this idea, and that is the concept called dechikas haketz. We're not allowed to hasten the end. And as I explained in my recent book, hastening the end of time means doing things that we can't justify. Because anytime we do things we can't justify, anytime we do things because that's what the Torah says, but we can't explain it, we are in a certain sense instigating hatred and bringing upon ourselves suffering. As I discussed at length, and as I alluded to earlier, that anytime we do something that's not justified and not reasoned, we're doing something that doesn't quite integrate with reality and makes people dislike us, because it's sort of a challenge to people's humanity and to their normalness. So that concept of we may not hasten the end, which is very, very strict, stands in contrast to we will do and we will hear. Because we will do and we will hear is basically saying the only way you will ever reach the end of Torah, the only way you will ever reach the future ideals that the Torah promises is by doing them before you understand them, because then you're forcing yourself to develop a theory to justify the Torah. So how does that work out with the idea that we're not supposed to hasten the end? So I would suggest that the restriction against hastening the end is that we are not allowed to make it happen any sooner than it will naturally happen. That is to say, as long as the end, and by the end we mean the goal of the Torah. See, the Torah is a futuristic religion because it has a goal that hasn't yet been attained. So the Torah is designed to attain some future goal. And that's called the kates, the end. We can't hasten it means we can't do anything to make it happen sooner than we're ready for it, because that comes with a lot of dysfunction. The dysfunction of doing things that can't be justified, can't be reasoned. But what we do need to do is ensure that there is a end, a kates. So we're not allowed to hasten the end, but because that's dangerous. But we do have to involve ourselves, engage in the dangerous path of making sure that there will eventually be an end. And the only way that will ever happen is because we jump in and do things. So there's the delicate balance between ensuring that there will eventually be a kates, ensuring that we'll eventually reach that end, that the Torah will achieve its goal. And that only happens because there are going to be unreasonable Jews who commit to ideas that on their face are unreasonable, but guess what? We're going to make them reasonable. Because by committing to them and by living by them, that forces us to find ideas, to develop ideas that are innate within the human being's mind, but would never have been developed if we weren't forced to develop them by the reality of living them. So we live with God in action, and therefore we just force ourselves to find God in our minds. That is, in a certain sense, a bringing upon ourselves the kates, unnaturally, with all the attendant dangers. But that's the dangers, that's the risks of Judaism that we commit to, like Rava committed to the risks of bleeding for Judaism, assured that eventually the wholeheartedness will lead him to the right goal. What we don't do is hasten it. That means to say, we do what's necessary to ensure that there will be a goal, an endpoint that is eventually reached, but past that we have to be patient. And that is a delicate political calibration that the wise men of Israel have to engage in. How much is necessary in order to ensure that there will be an end, that we will eventually get there, but more than that, to make it happen before it's time, more than that we don't do. This is at the root of the Torah. The root of the Torah is we will do and we will hear. And because we will do, and based on the fact that we will do, we will eventually learn to hear.